Let me ask you something. When was the last time you walked into a Johnny Rockets? Or sat down at a Round Table Pizza? Or maybe watched a game at Twin Peaks? Chances are you didn't think twice about who owned those places. You just showed up, ordered your food, maybe left a decent tip. Normal stuff. But behind every one of those restaurants, behind all 18 of them, there was one man, one family, one increasingly insane pile of debt. And a story so wild that when I first started digging into it, I genuinely had to stop and reread the same paragraph 3 times because I thought I was misunderstanding something. I wasn't. This is the story of Fat Brands, and it is not, at its core, a story about restaurants. It's a story about what happens when Wall Street financing meets a man who has already been to federal prison once and learned absolutely nothing from it. Let's start at the beginning, and I mean the actual beginning. Not 2017, not 2020. I mean 2004. A man named Andy Wiederhorn, running an investment firm called Fog Cutter Capital, pleads guilty in federal court. Tax fraud. Paying an illegal gratuity to an associate. He was sentenced to 18 months, and he served 14 months. And while he was sitting in a cell, Fog Cutter's board voted to pay him $4.6 million, his full salary during incarceration, plus a bonus equal to his entire restitution payment. The board literally reimbursed him for the cost of his crime. The backlash was so severe that Fog Cutter got delisted from NASDAQ. So we have conviction, prison, company pays his fine as a bonus, and delisted from the stock exchange. Most people's careers end there. Andy Wiederhorn's was just getting started. By 2003, Wiederhorn had already bought Fatburger through Fog Cutter. He went to prison the following year. When he got out, the brand was technically still his, though it would spend the next several years teetering through the Great Recession, with subsidiaries filing their own bankruptcy in 2009, before finally restructuring in 2011. And over the next several years, he quietly built it up. Refranchised locations, stabilized the brand, and in 2017, he launched Fat Brands, which stood for Fresh Authentic Tasty, as a holding company, taking it public through what the industry called a mini IPO. That structure, notably, attracted significantly less regulatory scrutiny than a traditional public offering. At this point, the strategy was actually pretty straightforward. Buy legacy restaurant brands that were underperforming, plug them into a central franchise infrastructure, collect royalties. It was a private equity playbook applied to fast food. And in the early years, Fat Brands was picking up brands for almost nothing. Elevation Burger, Hurricane Grill, Yala Mediterranean. Small deals, small prices, managed risk. But then something changed. In 2020, Wiederhorn's personal investment firm, Fog Cutter Capital, merged directly into Fat Brands. On paper, this gave Fat Brands more firepower to make acquisitions using stock instead of just cash or debt. In practice, it also conveniently allowed tens of millions of dollars in prior loans between the two entities to be quietly written off. It erased what federal prosecutors would later allege was already a decade of extraction. And starting in 2020, Fat Brands stopped shopping the bargain bin. It went on one of the most aggressive restaurant acquisition sprees in modern history. August 2020, Johnny Rockets, $25 million. July 2021, Global Franchise Group, $442 million. That deal alone brought in Round Table Pizza, Marble Slab Creamery, Great American Cookies, Pretzel Maker, and Hot Dog on a Stick. October 2021, Twin Peaks, $300 million. Then Fazoli's for $130 million. And Native Grill and Wings. In roughly 15 months, Fat Brands spent approximately $900 million acquiring restaurant chains. $900 $100 million. A company that had once needed to borrow $20 million at 20% interest from a single outside investor who almost ended up owning a huge chunk of the business was suddenly one of the largest restaurant brand collectors in the country. And you might be wondering, where did the money come from? Great question. The answer is something called whole business securitization. I want to explain this properly because it is central to everything that happens next. Here is the basic idea. FAT Brands took all of its franchise royalty streams, the fees that franchisees pay every week just to operate under the brand name, and placed them inside a series of shell companies. There were 5 of them, with names like FAT Brands, GFG Royalty Y, and Twin Hospitality I. Those shell companies then issued bonds to investors. Investors bought the bonds because they were backed by real, predictable revenue, those franchise royalties. And FAT Brands used the cash from selling those bonds to buy more restaurant chains. On its own, whole business securitization is not inherently evil. Plenty of companies use it. But here is where FAT Brands made a structural mistake that was, in hindsight, absolutely fatal. The securitization structure required those shell companies to collect the royalties and to pay FAT Brands corporate a management fee to run operations. That management fee was approximately $17 million a year. The actual cost to run the corporate platform that supported all 18 brands was approximately $96 million a year. That is a $79 million annual gap, not a gap that emerged over time because of bad luck or a changing economy. A gap that was baked directly into the structure from the moment the deals were signed. The company was legally separated from its own revenue. It was a franchisor that could not access its own franchise fees, and they bought $900 million worth of restaurants on top of it. Now, here is where I have to stop and be honest with you about something, because this is the part of the story that genuinely got to me. I have covered a lot of corporate collapses on this channel. I have looked at companies that made bad bets, companies that were disrupted, companies that just ran out of time. And in most of those cases, I can find the moment where the people inside the building convinced themselves it was going to work. The optimistic projections, the growth assumptions, the market conditions they were betting on. With FAT Brands, I kept looking for that story, and I found something different. Because while the company was being structurally starved by its own debt architecture, while that $79 million annual gap was quietly draining the business, something else was happening at the very top. Beginning in 2010, Wiederhorn allegedly funneled $47 million to himself through companies he controlled, loans later forgiven. Between 2017 and 2021, prosecutors say this was 44% of FAT Brands' total revenue. The company could not pay its own bills. So when cash ran out, the SEC's complaint alleges Wiederhorn told his son Thayer, then chief marketing officer, to wire money back through company credit cards, recycling funds to hide the extraction. Where did it go? Private jets, vacations, rent, mortgage payments, jewelry. The SEC's figure is $27 million in personal expenses, paid by a public company, never disclosed. And the board, meant to catch exactly this, by 2023, barely existed. After directors cooperated with investigators, Wiederhorn replaced every independent member with 3 children and their grandfather, a NASDAQ-listed public company governed by a family dinner. If you are finding this story as wild as I did when I first started researching it, and you want to see more investigations like this one, hit subscribe. We dig into exactly these kinds of collapses every week. It only takes a second, and it genuinely helps. In May 2024, the Department of Justice indicted Wiederhorn. Wire fraud, tax evasion, multiple counts. The IRS noted that as of March 2021, He personally owed $7.74 million in unpaid income taxes, accumulated over years while running a public company. An IRS special agent went on record calling him a serial tax cheat and said his actions over decades hurt not only his company and its shareholders, but every American taxpayer. Fat Brand's stock dropped 27% the day the charges were announced. The company had a market cap of $92 million at that point. It had over $1 billion in debt. And then something happened that I genuinely did not see coming when I was building this timeline. In July 2025, the Department of Justice dropped all criminal charges against Wiederhorn. Now, the reason this matters, beyond the obvious, is what happened around the same time. The assistant U.S. attorney prosecuting the case, a man named Adam Schleifer, was fired without explanation. The termination notice was emailed to him 1 hour after a conservative media personality named Laura Loomer called for his firing in a social media post, citing his alleged criticism of President Trump. Schleifer subsequently filed a wrongful termination case, calling the dismissal unlawful and politically motivated. Wiederhorn, for his part, has donated over $46,000 to Trump's campaign since 2019. Civil charges brought by the SEC remain active, but the criminal case is gone. By the time the legal drama was resolving, the operational reality was catching up fast. Fat Brands accumulated $85.5 million in total litigation costs, and according to bondholders and court filings, a material portion of that went directly to Wiederhorn's personal attorneys. Those fees were paid by a business that was simultaneously telling Round Table Pizza franchisees it could not send them their Pepsi rebate checks. Those franchisees had not received their quarterly rebates since 2023. Round Table Pizza went without advertising for several months after Fat Brands missed a payment to its marketing vendor. Smoky Bones, a brand Fat Brands had separately acquired in 2023, took out merchant cash advance loans with annualized interest rates that can exceed 100%. That is the kind of financing that pushes restaurants into bankruptcy in normal circumstances, and Fat Brands was using it to stay alive. And just before the bankruptcy filing, 3 top executives, 2 of them Wiederhorn's sons, received large pay raises and retention bonuses. The franchisees did not get their rebates. The executives got their bonuses. If you are waiting for the moment in this story where I tell you it gets better, it does not. On October 27th, 2025, Fat Brands missed a routine quarterly bond payment. There was not enough cash in the collection accounts. On November 17th, UMB Bank, the trustee overseeing the securitizations, sent acceleration notices. $1,256.5 million in principal, plus $43.2 million in accrued interest, was declared immediately due and payable. Fat Brands filed an SEC disclosure that said the company and the securitization issuers did not currently have amounts on hand to pay such principal and interest. Translation: we do not have the money. We never had the money. The structure made it essentially impossible to have the money. On January 26, 2026, Fat Brands filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in the Southern District of Texas. 18 brands, 2,200 locations, 45,000 corporate and franchise employees. All of it tied to one balance sheet. All of it going into restructuring at once. Here's what makes the bankruptcy itself almost darkly funny, if you're in the mood for that kind of thing. Bondholders, the people owed $1.4 billion, filed an emergency request to have a trustee appointed to run the company instead of Wiederhorn. The request was denied. They then asked the court to suspend Wiederhorn after he went ahead and sold 9 million Twin Peaks shares to an outside investor, days after the bankruptcy filing, without seeking court approval, which is a serious violation of bankruptcy rules. Judge Alfredo Perez said on record, "This does violate the rule of no surprises, and that's concerning." Wiederhorn was not removed. He is currently running the company through its own bankruptcy, and he has expressed his desire to buy the company out of bankruptcy, meaning the man whom bondholders have accused in court filings of treating the company as his personal piggy bank could emerge from this process as the owner of the restructured entity. FAT Brand's response to all of this was to file court documents arguing that the sophisticated hedge funds who bought their bonds knew exactly who Andy Wiederhorn was before they invested, that the lenders made a knowing bet and are now pretending to be surprised, which honestly, they might not be entirely wrong about, and that just makes the whole thing worse. So what is the actual lesson here? Because there are three that matter. First, whole business securitization. FAT Brands isn't alone. TGI Fridays and Hooters collapsed under this same model recently. It works with high margins, but apply it to a leveraged acquisition spree run by a family with a history of self-dealing, and there is zero margin for error. Second, governance. Replacing your board with your children after directors start cooperating with the FBI is not a quirky management decision. For a NASDAQ company, it's a systemic failure in real time. Third, who pays? Not the hedge funds or Wiederhorn. It's the 45,000 employees at 2,200 locations working while the building burned. It's the franchisees who lost their savings. They always pay most. FAT Brands didn't collapse because people stopped eating burgers or inflation squeezed margins. It collapsed because a convicted CEO used a public company as a personal bank, because a financing structure legally stripped the company's revenue, because $85.5 million in legal fees defended conduct he invited, because a prosecutor was fired over a social media post. And when the $1.4 billion bill came due, nothing was left. The restaurants are still open, for now. Whether they survive depends on a bankruptcy run by the very man who caused this. If you want to follow this story, subscribe. Every week, we dig into the corporate decisions and human consequences behind the headlines. Hit the button. See you next week.